All right, let's start, shall we, everyone? Yes.
Good job, David.
All right, I'm very glad to introduce Professor Cheryl Craig. Cheryl Craig has written multiple papers and books on teacher education, on narrative inquiry, on the use of narrative inquiry, on curriculum. She has been awarded multiple accolades and awards, so many such that I would do her injustice if I were to select a few to share with us. So I would recommend us to go to her website, cheryljcraig.com, and you can see the comprehensive listing of the publications and the awards and honors that she has been given. Instead, I would share an anecdote of how I met Professor Craig. We met in 2010 in Hong Kong in the second East Asia Teacher Education Research Conference. That year, I was in the midst of analyzing my data. I wanted to know how to craft a narrative because my doctoral thesis is using a narrative inquiry. For those who are familiar with narrative inquiry, you would know that Professor Craig is a big figure in the field of narrative inquiry. If we were to consider Jean Clendenin and Michael Connolly as the key figures, first generation narrative inquirers, then Professor Craig will be considered the key figure in second generation of narrative inquiry. Professor Craig was Professor Clendenin's doctoral student, and she also did a postdoc with Professor Michael Connolly. So I wanted to ask her, how would I craft a narrative based on 2.5 years worth of interview data? Yeah, and when I saw her name in the conference, I told myself, I got to go to that conference. I needed to answer that question. And that's how we met, and she helped me with crafting the narrative, and subsequently we corresponded via email. Yeah, and so without further ado, I'm elated to hand the time over to Professor Craig.
Than sharing education internationally, and that we can learn from each other. And it's such an important aspect. And so I'm going to be talking today about why the best love self in teaching and teacher education and teaching and learning. And I have been working on the area of the best love self for about 12 years, but it's getting much, much deeper since when I first started to work on it. But I'd like to start with this quote, that teachers emerge from who they are as human beings. And this is from Bob Bulow. And I think it's something that we are increasingly paying attention to in the field of education, because we've been doing work on teacher identity, which I've done a lot on, teacher community, that's an area that I worked on, teacher presence, teacher self, and all of these are areas that are increasingly receiving attention in teaching and teacher ed, and they will be receiving even more. But today I'm going to be talking about the best love self, which was a catchphrase used by Joseph J. Schwab. You mentioned my research professors and such. Joseph J. Schwab was the father of modern day inquiry, scientific inquiry in the US, and he's still considered one of the 5 top curriculums in the world. He was my postdoc's professor, and my doctoral professor was the professor of my postdoc. And so I'm sitting right on the line of them, and I'm reading this book. And so it was in the 1950s that he just popped in this catchphrase of our best love self. And I decided since then, I'm going to make it into a concept or an image, which I've been working on it. So when I just recently talked about the best love self with my own students, pre-service students, and I talked to them about the best love self about 3 months ago. Their first response was, why hadn't anybody else talked to me about it? Why didn't people talk about my best of self as a teacher? And they asked that question. And so they really latched onto that idea. And I think it's a question that we should ask as well. Why aren't we paying attention to the best love self of ourselves and also the people that we work with? And that's what I'm going to be working on today. But in this age of accountability, of what is called in the US or North America, or performativity, which is what it's called in Europe, and you may have another word for it here. We have been so busy stamping the image of the ideal teacher on the candidates that we work with, that we really have lost sight of their uniqueness as human beings and how they would like to be teachers. And we lose that. So today I'm going to take up this idea of the best love self, generally as it's risen with teachers of all disciplines. And then I am going to do, especially for Jason, a student, Ashley Thomas, teacher Ashley Thomas, who was an ESL teacher, and I think is very much fitted to who you are. And she's a more recent research participant. And her story really begs to be shared because she was not really originally part of my best love self research, and she wasn't even a part of my school reform research. But when I went to do teacher attrition study, even though I knew her for 12 years, it wasn't until I did my teacher attrition story that she arose as a research participant. And so then I began to looking at her. And when I started to put it all together, her story really, really was a story of the best love self. But just before I get going on that, I want to say that Ashley was a very complex person. I'm calling out the best love self story about her, but I'm not telling you about the fights in her family between the politics of the children and the politics of the adults. I'm not telling you about her gender identity pieces. I'm not telling you that her family was one of the a very well-known ranching family, and they drove their cattle right onto the railway. You know, there's so much about Ashley that's not in what I'm talking about. She's a very, very complex person, but I don't want you to just see her as kind of like a flat character, because she isn't. She has a lot going on, and you'll hopefully get that. So I'm going to start first with the concept of the best love self and how it's played out in my research program, and in what I've seen in happening elsewhere with others nationally and internationally. So let's begin. And we're going to go to, those are the places where I ran into the best love self as I was going, but we're going to begin in Houston, Texas. And so that's where you introduced me. And so I am an endowed chair, and I'm the Houston Endowment Endowed Chair of urban education. So it's not unusual that you find me doing research in the greater Houston area. So all my work is in that specific area, and that's what I do. So there was a greater Houston middle school teacher, a literacy teacher. And what happened for him, he had a consultant come to his classroom, brought in by school. And this consultant came to his classroom and told him, you can no longer teach the Holocaust unit to these students. And this was the unit that he had been working on for years. Every summer he'd go to Israel or he'd go to Europe, and he'd gather more information and enrich that topic. But this consultant came in and said, you can't do that anymore. All of the 8th grade teachers must teach the same unit. So every one of them had to change from what they were doing, which they had developed the way they wanted to do, and they had to come to some, maybe more of a pablum unit that they'd all have to do. And so that's happened, and that happened with him. And then there was another literacy teacher, and her name is Laura Curtis. And she said that there was so much intervention in her teaching that she felt, and this is something symbolic of my research program, metaphors ring wildly in my research program. She described herself as a butterfly under a pin, a button, a biological metaphor, the butterfly splayed out and losing voice, not having any air, not having any voice. And she likened herself to the butterfly under the pin. She had been a curriculum maker, but now she was forced to be an implementer. And she didn't like it. And she was trapped and she was being weighed down. And meanwhile, Daryl was saying, I focus on data, and it's now becoming reified. And it really doesn't matter what teachers want to do. It's all it is where's the data? Where's the data? Where's the data? And who they are as people didn't matter. And he told us that. So these examples, as well as many of my own at the university, because whatever's happening in the schools is also happening in higher ed at a slower rate, but still happening. This caused me to think that I was coming into a new conceptualization, and I didn't know what to call it, but I knew I was onto something. So I was awake to it, but I didn't have words. So somewhat later, I was in Beijing, China, and I was a keynote address that I was doing there. And another person who was a platform speaker is the well-known Miriam Ben Perez. She died very recently from Israel. And she was telling a story about a experienced teacher study she had done. And she asked this teacher, what are the moments you most remember from being a teacher? And this teacher said, I was evaluated by the same superintendent twice. Once I did a mathematics lesson, and I did it from a guidebook. And the other time I was language arts and Bible is required in Israel. And language arts and Bible, and I did my own curriculum making. And when I finished, the superintendent called me aside, and he said, "Of course, you're fine as a teacher." But he also said, "You shouldn't be using a teaching method that doesn't suit your personality. Be yourself." And she admitted, I was not myself when I was doing the math lesson. And so when he said that, he said, you should not be sacrificing the personal for the professional. You should be able to find a balance there, and then they would both be mutually informing one another. And what is very interesting about this, and it's interesting that I'm also remembering it, this teacher said this 8 years after she retired from a 35-year-old career. Miriam Ben Perez wrote it in a 1995 book, did not report it till 2009. I heard it in 2009 and I remembered it, and I included it in my book in 2020. So you can see it has a lot of staying power across a number of people. And I think that's where we start to see the translation of research from one researcher to another. The next piece of information that affected me was I was in ISAT conference in Rovaniemi, Finland. If you don't know that, that's where the real Santa Claus is. It's right at the North Pole. It's right at the North Pole and at the Arctic Circle. And a Dutch researcher there, a Dutch doctoral student, her name was Marieke Pillen. I took the name down. I was listening to her presentation, and she was talking about this mentor, student having a mentor. And the student said, the mentor tells me how to teach, but that's not how I want to teach. It doesn't suit me. Again, we've got this being oppressed to do it like everybody else versus being suited. And so once more, we see in this case, the mentor teacher is now the implementer and is deciding in advance what should constitute the most prevalent teaching practices. And so we have this going on. And meanwhile, though, we have the beginning teacher. He's a beginning teacher, but he knows his knowing and his sensibilities are being diminished, are being erased, but not without him saying, my personal practical knowledge is important, and sharing his regrets. And again, now we see the Dutch researchers, just like Miriam Ben Perez in Israel, the Dutch researchers are now saying this quote is significant and it goes into our presentation. I'm sitting back in the audience, I'm saying this quote is significant, it goes in my presentation. So around then, I was also reading Ivor Goodson's work. And Ivor Goodson is a British researcher, and he was employed by both Canadian and American universities. I believe he probably was employed by an American university, then eventually went back to Britain. But he was talking about what he was doing with an American teacher, and it really informed my curriculum making as well. And the American teacher, he was told, Goodson, that what's happening is a McDonaldization of education. Teachers are being made into passive deliverers. And again, it's been around for a while. A pre-digested curriculum, we're pre-digesting it. And so according to that teacher, what the curriculum of people in charge of curriculum governance are trying to remove the teacher's personality from teaching, to get rid of the teacher as the middleman, a middle person, and just have the teaching and the content and no teacher, which we know that's not possible. And he concluded that education takes place in the corner of the eye. It's not what we aim for that happens, that people really learn, but it's the peripherals, the kind of important moments that happen. So once again, we're seeing this tension between curriculum making and curriculum implementing. Now, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with curriculum implementing. That's what governments give us to do. Governments and society pay teachers salaries. Teachers need to do what they're charged to do. But they are also minded people, and they've also trained people. So they have knowledge too, and it's curriculum making. So when I say we just don't, I'm not talking about teachers being just curriculum makers, but I'm thinking about how are you as a curriculum maker taking implementation into mind with these students in this place at this time and making it into a very rich curriculum making rather than a flat, here's the content, here's the student, content, student. And of course, we also know if we don't have the teacher in the middle, there's nothing to keep those teachers teaching. They can be attrition statistics because they could go and do something else and not be connected to it in any way. So we have that going on. And so at this point, I knew I had accumulated enough international resources that what I was doing in my own research could be supported with what I was seeing around the world. And you saw those places in the maps. And when I go to conferences, for those people who are new to being researchers, I am listening not only to what people are presenting, but I'm looking at whether it supports what I'm doing or it challenges what I'm doing, because then I know what I need to do when I get home. And so I was learning from Miriam Ben Perez in China. I was learning from the American teacher that British Professor Goodson had, and of course the Dutch researcher in Finland. And then all those teachers in Houston I'm working with. But then something totally out of the ordinary happened. I was in my office and I was reading this book, and you would not, it's not unusual that I'd be reading this book. This is Joseph Schwab's collected works. And I have, my advisors are retiring, and I sort of have to be the person that knows a great deal. I'm now considered, quote, the Schwab expert in the US. So I am working on this, and I dropped the book on the floor. And I'm going to pull this up close to my face. And this is what he said. So I had no word for it. He said, he, the teacher, wants something more for his students than the capacity to give him back the report of what he himself has said. He wants them to possess a knowledge or a skill in the same way that he possesses it as a part of his best loved self. He wants to communicate the fire he feels, the eros he possesses for a valued object. His controlled and conscious purpose is to liberate, not captivate the student. And there it was. I didn't need to find anything worth. I didn't need to find anything at all. Schwab had said it in the 1950s. There it was. but nothing had been done with it. He just slipped it in one little line. And so there's no need, although I could have gone and made my own thing up and put my name behind it, but it came off my research line. But Schwab's words uncannily mirrored the words that came from that American teacher that he described as a person as being in front of a person, giving a part of himself that he cares about. In short, he referred to his heroes, his best love self, and how he wanted to share that and the best part of what he knows with the students he teaches. And so from that point onward, I introduced the best love self as a new pillar in my research program. I began to flesh out the concept more fully in keynote addresses, in chapters and in articles. And my book that I wrote in 2020 or was published in 2020 is Curriculum Making, which is my area, Reciprocal Learning from the Canada-China Reciprocal Learning Process, and The Best Love Self. So that's where it's all starting to line up. And so all of a sudden, to my autobiographical narrative inquiries, I discussed how sacrificing one's best love self for what you need to do at your institution is sometimes too high of a price to pay. And in an ISAT keynote address, I spoke of the best love self, choice in action, and how I prefer to be a generous scholar, unless I'm backed into a corner, something different. And in an invited handbook chapter, I was asked to, actually it was Miriam was asked to summarize Schwab's research, and she turned around and invited me, and then she died before we started. So fortunately, I had been thinking about it, so it was very easy for me to do it and dedicate it to her. But I made six case studies of how Schwab's work was moving forward in the world. And some of them were Conley and Clendenin, some of them was Miriam Ben-Perez, and some of them were my own. And so that what we see in all of these things was the takeaway point is this: a teacher's pursuit of their own best love self ignites students' passions for lifelong learning in a way that patterns their teachers' engagements of and excitement about learning. So the teacher is kind of a transmitter, can be direct, or they can learn from their teacher. However, we're getting now into Ashley Thomas, which I want to talk about because it brings me to my work with Ashley Thomas. And she was always very, very interested in my school reform work and in my teacher attrition work. And so she was always around, but I never did research for her for 12 years. I knew her all the time, but when I didn't know that she quit because there was 85 teachers in the school. But she was different than the other teachers I worked with. The other ones were science, math, language arts. They were all the core subjects, but she was not. She was teaching ESL as a non-core discipline. She was an English as a second language teacher. And so as I worked with her, I knew from the very beginning that she was highly valued by her principal because the principal made a point of telling me I had this incredible English as a second language teacher. And she not only brings the students into class and does exciting things with them, but she invites their parents, mostly the mothers, and the mothers come and learn English alongside their children. And she said, this is really remarkable what this teacher is doing. She had also told me that I have a teacher in the school who was trained at Oxford, but I never paid attention to that. But even as I went and saw Ashley teach, I could see the strong bonds that she was forging with all the students. And it was as a result of her best love self of dealing with these English language learners. And she clearly had the ability to pull on what she could do to draw on the students' best love selves and to draw on the parents' best love self. And she found a very sweet spot of learning. And I could see how she could do this. And what we have is that she had this passion for learning. And so she was in this public school in Texas, and she starts to tell me a little bit about her life. What's significant, it's actually very significant about her, is that she came from this very wealthy family, as I've indicated, and that she went to school with the workers' children. And so the workers were Hispanics. Her family was white. And she said, now in the South at this time, there would be de facto segregation, but it was mostly between the whites and the blacks, right? The whites would be in one school, the blacks would be in another school. But here in this farming or ranching area, it's de facto between the whites and the Hispanics. So she would be put into a white classroom, and the workers' children would go into a Hispanic classroom. But she witnessed the children, the Mexican children or South American children, being humiliated by some of the teachers and by many of the students because they couldn't speak fluent English. And this really had an impressive point on Ashley. She took it upon herself to teach a young Mexican girl how to speak English. And she continues to go to that point of being able to help this girl that she couldn't. And she said that was the point. She's in grade 2, and she learned about racial inequities. And she also learned about her love of language. And she learned about her love of teaching. And she also learned social justice. And you'll start to see this rolling through her narrative. And so when we start to think what makes a good teacher, we're seeing something of this happen. But of course, there's a long journey that's going on between Ashley at grade 2 and where she goes from there. And what we have is she went to a public middle school. Her parents are very wealthy. She goes to the city and they pay a high premium for her to go to a private high school. She decides that she wants to go to Oxford University. Her parents have money to pay for her to go. She goes there. And also she needs to perfect, she does Spanish and French, and she needs to perfect her French. And so she goes to France to deal with her French accent. And so this is rather unusual, but it's just a regular teacher that I just happened upon. And so what we have here is her love of language, her love of social justice, her everything that's afforded her because of her family's wealth. And so we have that. And so what she does is she goes and she graduates with a double major in French and Spanish. And here we see her lifelong learning of language and of learning. And she's ready and primed to help other people. Then she sampled a number of careers, and now this is interesting. She ends up at Amnesty International, which is a human rights organization. And she has 3 strong languages, English, Spanish, and French. And she helps many, many people in settling their issues. And so she does that, and she has this keen knowledge. And but she says all the time when she's telling me about Amnesty International, this is just like what I ran into in grade 2. This is just a continuation of that. And so when Ashley heard that one of the main middle schools in Houston needed an ESL teacher, she immediately applied. That was the job for her, right? However, when she got the job, the principal said to her, you know what? I need a Spanish teacher, and I can't find a Spanish teacher. You can speak Spanish beautifully. I'll give you the Spanish teacher. I'll hire somebody else to do the ESL. But she said, once I get another ESL, another Spanish teacher, I'll let you out of Spanish. So that was the deal. So she started out with Spanish because she was very, very good at it. And so she pleased that principal because it was more difficult to find a Spanish teacher. And so Ashley's knowing of teaching, her whole desire as a teacher was to use English as a second language to lift children out of poverty. through high quality English language instruction. But she was not without a role model. There was a role model teacher, an ESL teacher at that school who had taught a student called Anna Padrana. Anna Padrana, she managed to get an immigrant student to be the president of a 1,500 student body. And Anna Padrana went on to a very prestigious university at the East Coast of the US. She went to Princeton University. She went to New York Law School, and she's now currently a lawyer in New York City. And so that's going on. But then Ashley says, I can copycat that. Look at the way she mentored her. I can do that. So she picks up a student immediately, and her student goes to bioengineering at Johns Hopkins University. And then there's many, but I'll just tell you about 2 or 3 more. 2 other students were Miguel from El Salvador and Lilan from Vietnam. She helped Miguel's family become financially stable because she had money to give loans to families so they could get back, right? She would loan the family money to be able to get themselves on their feet. And she, with Lilan, she worked with her as well. And she ushered Miguel into advanced English language learning. And with Lilan, she devoured the English language, and she learned handfuls of words every night. And then one time, Lilan asked Ashley, what should I be? And Ashley says, you know, a medical profession would be nice. And then on the backhand, she says, do you know, people need to know how to handle money. See, because that's her family. You need to know your family. You need to know how to handle money. So Ashley told her that. And then a few years later, probably about 4 or 5 years later, Lilan shows up at the school. And guess what? She's a nurse and a chartered accountant. Then there was Illich Monroy. He was from Mexico, and what she did with him is the school is also a gifted and talented school, so she goes and barters with all the gifted and talented teachers. If you'll just take one more student, I'll do this for you. If you take one more student, because he wouldn't be on the roll to be in those classes, but they say, okay, one more, 33, 34, okay, I'll take them. And so what she did with that, with him, and then she got him into a technology high school. So she keeps with these children all the time. He finished a 5-year architecture degree, and he came out with a positive bank balance. How did he do that? She found a summer job for him working for an energy company. And so this is the kind of involvement that this ESL teacher had going. And so once again, we start to see Ashley's best love self, which is those things that I was telling you about here. You see her igniting the student's best love self. They can either continue to be lit by her flame, or they're starting to light their own. And I'm sure the one that's the attorney in New York City is lighting his own. But as with every story, it's a counterplot. Horror of horrors. The state reduces money for English second language learners. And the school district decides to shut down her program. And they give her the choice. You can stay here at this school and teach French or Spanish, or you can go to another school and be an ESL teacher. And she took the choice to stay with her friends. But she said that was the day you would start to see her best love self tipping. That was the day I decided I would retire as soon as I could. I had only 8 years at most to put in. So at this point, there's been never any mention of quitting teaching, nothing at all. This day, I've had my days. They're pushing me. And so as she chose to teach French, and as a French teacher, she watched all those ESL students in that school that had no support whatsoever. And she could give She could recite the problems they had. Here's the word charge. You charge something and put it on your credit card, or you charge as in more. They didn't know the difference. The teachers are running around. These students have trouble with mathematics. And Ashley says, the problem is not mathematics. The problem is English. It's English. They have no support. And she said to herself, I wonder, would Anna Pedrana, Illich, Moreau, Milan, McGill, any of them, would have they done so well as they did if they didn't have that support? And also the school no longer had role models, Spanish or French role models. Now all they had for the foreign languages were custodians and secretaries. They didn't have their teaching staff, they didn't have their administrators that were fluent in language as well. And at the same time, there was this great requirement for language learning, foreign language learning, as in Spanish and in English. But Ashley knew that that was just a cover story. All of those students did not want to learn Spanish or French. All they wanted was their diploma requirement. The language was just a step to the diploma. And so we start to see Ashley's best loved self dwindling. And it was really they were really blatantly squandering the opportunity to learn a second language. And this greatly impacted her best loved self. And here's her own words: the absence of the feelings that I was having a direct contribution to the greater good by teaching a foreign language that was not taken seriously killed the joy that I had found in my ESL assignment. And then plot thickens. Further to this, she had a very overcrowded classroom, 33 desks back to back. And she had one student sitting in her desk, one student sitting on a stool, and 10 students on the floor. And this is what she was teaching. And further to that, there was a major hole in the floor, which the teaching staff believed it might be an asbestos leak and would be dangerous to the children's and her life. She reported it several times, and nobody responded to her. However, a very influential parent found out about it, and she reported it immediately, and it wasn't midterm. So for the next 3.5 weeks, while they fix the hole on the floor, Ashley has to teach in a different classroom every period, over 3 floors of period. Can you imagine? Pick up a class and go and find where I need to teach. Bring all your supplies with you, and then move here and move here and move here. And then it gets worse. She gets back into her teaching room. Her class has no established routines because they've been rolling around for 3.5 weeks, and the assistant principal decides to evaluate her. And she, of course, her no routines. She ends up getting 2s on 5s. And the AP said, kind of glibly, well, you know, you're older, you shouldn't care about this anymore. And for Ashley, that was the last straw. Ashley did care, but she said, I don't care to stay here. I'm out of here. And Ashley became a teacher attrition statistic. So we talk about teacher attrition, we talk about shortage, this conglomeration of things are causing this. And she quit her much loved profession in the middle of the semester, and she never made it to retirement. But that's when we start to see 2 autobiographical threads of Ashley's narrative. And it's true of all of our teachers. They bring stories with them. We do not know what they are, but they do play into the decisions they make. First of all, at this point, it comes out, I knew Ashley's family was wealthy. I knew about the cattle going on to one of the last cattle roundups in the US. I knew about, certain things that she got to do, like her schooling. But I didn't know she was completely independent, wealthy, and she never, ever had to be a teacher. Imagine, she chose to be a teacher because of her social justice orientation, her love of language, her love of teaching. And so that's where we start to see that her love of teaching was her essence as a teacher. But very importantly, that we as educators need to know that her love of language intertwined with her long-term defense of social justice could overpower her love of teaching. So it's multiple things. They come together in a certain way that ends up being her last straw. And so what we're seeing here is this powerfully shows that there's multiple factors associated with English second language teacher retention and attrition, all of which are intimately related to the best love self. And we've never previously looked at the best love self as a factor that we need to look at. And I'm going to bring it back to Ashley's own words. This is what she said. While I had been using skills acquired in my education and learning as a living, the absence of that initial altruism that I felt made teaching unfulfilling. And for me, foreign language teaching became nothing more than classroom management. And that's what we wouldn't want to happen. So in closing, my research with Ashley Thomas, more than any of the other teachers I've worked with, illuminated these autobiographical threads about the best love self. And we could find out what were her consumatory experiences, what were those high points she had of working with Illich and working with this student and working with that student, a real high. And when she's talking to you, it's just the best thing in the world. But when she's talking about what happened with the floor and with that assistant principal and all of that stuff, we get to see what happens. But we see this pivotal way, this how she had these things that were intertwined, longing to teach and learn, her vocation to be a teacher, her love of language and communication. By the way, as a researcher, wonderful. I have never had someone talk as much as she did and write as beautifully as she did. She half did the work for me. And she had this huge desire to stamp out social inequity. And so what Ashley felt on the outside as an educator and a person, what she felt in the inside as an educator and a person was what she enacted on the outside as a teacher and very much as a citizen, a school citizen and a citizen of the US. So in many ways, she accomplished what the poet Andre Lorde calls genuine change in the world. And so these powerful interwoven threads came apart when she encountered dead space. Dead space, according to Dewey, is space where there's no life in it. There was no life in it when she did the evaluation. There was no life in it when she was teaching language and students didn't want to learn language. They were just putting in time. And only then did the idea of quitting teacher ever cross her mind. All through all of that narrative, there was no talk of quitting teaching until that happened. So until that point, her heroes had blessed her with what the poet Muriel Reicherser called living moments that fruitfully blend past, present, and future of the best loved self. And all of a sudden, we start to see, also using from Reicherser, this supports the thesis that Reicherser says is that the world is made up of stories as much as it's made of atoms. It's a big problem. It's made of stories as much of it as atoms. There's some other researchers that say stories are so important. You can move from one story to another story to another story, but you can't ever get out of story. Our whole existence is story. And only through approaching teachers' experiences narratively, as I've tried to do throughout this talk, can we see the complexities underlying teaching, and especially English second language teaching and learning. And I sincerely thank you for the opportunity to share this with you today. And I welcome your questions because there's lots of more complexities about Ashley that we can talk about. Thank you.